crop survey. And it's great that many of you are familiar with that. We have been doing the survey since really covering the 2012 crop year was the first year it was done, and there were 5 years where we did it every year. The survey has always focused on farmers as opposed to other audiences. In fact, when people open up the survey, they're asked if they're a farmer, and if they're not, they're kind of redirected out of the survey. Of course, we have both full-time and part-time farmers filling out the survey. The last 2 times we've done the survey have not been on an annual interview. They've been on 3-year intervals. We kind of slowed down the pace of doing the survey. I suspect that's kind of where we'll be going forward. But the most recent one was covering the 2022 cropping season, and it was done early this year with the results released in August. So you may have seen a little publicity around August. The survey has a lot of questions, and I'll just kind of walk you through the methodology here. We actually had 110 questions, but the good news is no single farmer answers all 110 questions. That would be way too much to expect of them. We use, as you're probably familiar with Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, a branching approach so that people can just see the questions relevant to them. So a typical farmer might be answering, 30, 40 questions. A lot of them are pretty fast to respond to. We do have questions both for cover crop users and farmers not yet using cover crops. The ones for the latter group are a shorter list of questions, and I'm going to show you a few of those results as well today, although the bulk of my remarks will be on farmers that have been using cover crops. I need to move one thing out of the way here. There we go. So the survey link is promoted through partners, different organizations that are involved with the work. So SARE is the main funder of the survey. The American Seed Trade Association, or ASTA, also kicks in some money. And that money goes to the Conservation Technology Information Center, which most of you are probably familiar with, but if you're not, it's a nonprofit based in Indiana that does a variety of education and analysis efforts around conservation activities. This year, we had just under 800 farmers respond to the survey, and I'll show you where those come from around the country. So we had quite a few from Illinois, 57, and definitely the biggest number was from the Midwest. But the nice thing was we had some respondents from almost every single state. The only one we didn't have a response from was New Hampshire. Really good distribution on ages overall. We know that farmers with row crops are kind of skewed to the older end, but we did have a pretty good distribution on ages, and then also a good distribution on farm sizes. This is almost like we perfectly designed this, but it just happened to fall out this way that we did have some farmers on that high end, 2,000 acres or more, but you can see some smaller acreage ones. And as you can imagine, those were more horticultural producers. These are the types of producers, how they viewed themselves as either being primarily a commodity producer. That was about half of the audience, but we had another big fraction, 16%, that said they produced both commodity crops and horticulture. And then there was about 22% that just saw themselves as strictly horticulture, and then others that had livestock. So pretty good distribution in terms of types of farmers. There's always interest in, are the people using cover crops one who own their land or rent their land? And clearly in the majority of cases, it's probably some of both. And we can see that here, but there was a fair number, about a third, that owned 100% of the land they farm. And keep in mind, this is both horticulture and commodity farmers and some livestock producers. But otherwise, a distribution in terms of whether they own, less than 25% or more than 3/4, kind of what you'd expect. In terms of the green bars, those are the farmers that reported using cover crops, and the gold bars are those that were not yet using cover crops. Not a real big difference here in terms of those distributions. In terms of tillage, though, there was more of a difference. For the farmers using cover crops, they were more likely to be no-till. About half of them that responded to the survey identified themselves as continuous no-tillers, and another 12% rotational no-till, whereas somewhat less, about 30% of the farmers that were non-users of cover crops identified themselves as no-tillers. So that's probably not a surprise, but still kind of notable, I think. And then when we go to the other end of the spectrum for conventional tillage, certainly a higher percentage there among the non-users we're using conventional tillage. But again, a distribution across a range of approaches here. What we asked kind of for the first time on this survey, and I should say the survey is always a mix of questions we ask every year, like yield and acreage and what cover crops are you using, and then some new questions. And so about half of what you're going to see today are some new questions for us. But I should also say you're only going to see about half the results in the survey. It would take too long to go through them all because it's with 110 questions, a lot of graphs, but I'm going to try to go through quite a bit of data here in a short amount of time. With tillage changes, for the first time, we kind of asked, are you changing your tillage system if you're using cover crops? Because anecdotally, we kind of heard that farmers get interested in soil health, even if they've been doing some tillage and start cutting back on tillage to reduce disturbance. And we see that. Quite a large number were significantly reducing their tillage, and additional ones were slightly reducing their tillage, but also a fair number that were continuing with what we're doing. I expect a lot of those were the no-tillers, because keep in mind, a large percentage were already no-tilling. In terms of the impact on the cover crop to transitioning to no-till, I've heard more and more farmers say that they find cover crops help ease that transition to no-till, and that's reflected in the responses here. A relatively small number said it made the transition harder to no-till. Some said it worked just as well, but the big majority said it made that transition easier, and it probably relates to reducing some compaction, helping rain get into the soil, and some other short-term changes on those soil properties that the cover crops are helping with. We specifically asked about that. We saw a variety of responses. Farmers could select more than one option here. Again, that reduced compaction is part of it, better soil moisture management. Notably, not too many talked about the soil warming faster in the spring, but a variety of other benefits helping with that transition. Now, acreage is always interesting to look at. One thing I'll tell you with the survey is just because of the way the survey is done, we don't have an ability to estimate what's the total amount of acreage of cover crops in the United States. I have other data that I kind of put together with the survey and census data and other sources of information. I would guess we're probably at around 22 to 24 million acres of cover crops in the U.S. This past fall, but we'll find out what the census says when those results are released next spring. But every year we've done the survey, we've seen this strong upward trend. We asked farmers, how many acres of cover crops did you plant each of the last 5 years? So that's what's generating this data. Now, keep in mind, this is both row crop farmers and horticulture producers. If we took out the horticulture producers, these numbers would be a little larger, maybe closer to 500 acres on average, but I don't have that exact figure. We have asked in a variety of ways about the goals for using cover crops. It's not a surprise to anybody that when people are given multiple choices that they're going to pick soil health as the top choice, but they're also definitely interested in soil organic matter and soil carbon. I think farmers are increasingly getting aware of the fact that cover crops can help get rain into the soil, so you see that's a high response. Erosion obviously has been a long-term benefit that many people have recognized as a reason to use cover crops. Weed management kind of keeps getting higher and higher on the list as a reason farmers are using cover crops. So lots of different reasons, and again, not a surprise, but interesting to see how those break out. Now, one thing we looked at for the first time this year was managing cover crops after corn. We know in states like Illinois, there's been challenges with using cereal rye, for example, in particular in front of corn. And so we wanted to get a little better sense of how farmers are dealing with that. And so I've got a few slides to look at that. One question was just about when are they terminating before corn? Now, keep in mind, this is not just Illinois. This is all states that you're seeing responses from here. But a fair number were planting green. On the other hand, there's also a fairly large number that are terminating pretty early, even 15 days or more, but some in that 8 to 14 days, some a week before, and some said not applicable. Those were probably ones that had winter kill cover crops. So we know that one thing that can help when you're using a winter cereal like rye, triticale wheat before corn is to address the potential tie-up of nitrogen from that cover crop for that early corn seedling. And so we wanted to ask about whether that was affecting people's nitrogen management. And you can see about 44% in this green slice were applying extra nitrogen. But there's also a big fraction just under 40 in that gold slice that were not applying extra nitrogen. Maybe they were terminating early or just not recognizing they needed that. And then there were some that were just avoiding winter cereals before corn. And I suspect over time, as we get some new varieties of cover crops and so on, we may see that fraction grow even larger. Now, that nitrogen application at corn planting, we know can be very helpful to offsetting any potential nitrogen tie-up. And there were some that were using a 2x2 applicator. I've had a lot of farmers tell me they don't have a 2x2 applicator on their planter, and I think that reflects why you see a big fraction that are not doing that. So others were either banding the fertilizer over the row or just simply broadcasting some extra nitrogen at planting time. And any of those we know can work. The key is to get some extra nitrogen to that corn seedling to offset any potential tie-up. Now, switching to weed control, it's always interesting to see this. I personally think as we look at the farmers not yet using cover crops, that this is going to be a reason that they start to take cover crops more seriously and consider them, is the emergence of more herbicide-resistant weeds out there. So probably not a surprise, almost 3/4 said that weed control is better, that big green slice. But some said it really wasn't impacted. It may have had to do with the type of cover crop they used. Maybe they used a winter kill cover crop or just didn't see as big of an impact. But almost none of them, just under 2%, said the weed control was worse with the cover crop. In terms of herbicide cost, and we've looked at this for a couple surveys now. A lot of the farmers say they just kept with what they were doing, and so they had no change in the herbicides, but many are having some savings. If you added all those other numbers together, it's about half of the farmers are having some savings, and only a handful felt they had higher cost, maybe because of that burn down that they're doing or other reasons. So some had a fairly substantial savings of $16 to $20 or more. But many, it was a more modest savings, but of course, every bit helps. Looking similarly at soybean farmers, very similar breakdown on the pie chart. About 3/4 again of the farmers felt that their weed control was better with cover crops in front of soybeans. And a pretty similar pattern on the herbicide cost savings. There were a few more that saved $20 or more per acre, but otherwise a pretty similar pattern. So switching over to what species of cover crops are farmers using, and what are they doing with mixes? That's always interesting to see. So everybody knows cereal rye is the most popular cover crop, and that showed up in our survey. It's used more than twice as much as any other cover crop, and these were the actual acres of the farmers who responded to the survey. But the other takeaway for me is just how many different cover crops farmers are using. And we did not ask about all 40 plus species being sold, but you can see even among the top 15, 18 species, there's quite a bit of different ones being used. Part of that reflects interest in mixes. So if we ask about mixes, 65% of the farmers said they used mixes in 2022 and plan to use them again. But there were just a couple percent that said they used them in 22, but would not use them. So in other words, the farmers are pretty happy with those mixes. There were that gold slice 14% did not plant mixes last year, but thought they probably would this coming year. And then there was 18% that just haven't tried mixes and weren't showing an interest in it yet. So one thing I would say, and I'll come back to this later, is the longer farmers use cover crops, the more they tend to get involved with cover crop mixes. In terms of the number of species used in a cover crop mix, it's pretty well distributed. Some are doing 2, 3, 4. Some are doing higher rates. I think those are often with summer cover crop cocktails where we get those 8 or more species. And when we look at what people are using in a mix, it's pretty similar to what we see for the single species. The rye, of course, is still common in mixes, but it doesn't stand out quite as much from the others. You see a little bit bigger percentages on the legumes and brassicas, but certainly a wide variety of things being used in those mixes. In terms of diversity, as I just alluded to, farmers tend to increase the cover crop mix diversity over time. They get interested in what other species can help them with the particular needs they have. And so you can see, although some are increasing, about a similar number are keeping it the same. So it varies depending on how many years they've been doing cover crops. Yield impacts are always a big interest. I'm going to show you the data in a couple different ways. This is a dot distribution, obviously, of yields as a whole. We've known for a long time that individual field and farm experiences vary widely with yield impacts. Depends on soil type, cropping system, the cover crop being used, when it's terminated, moisture conditions, of course, all kinds of factors. You get some people that had a really terrific benefit from cover crops in terms of yield, and then others that had a modest loss and a few that had a bigger loss. Maybe they just lost all their moisture in a dry spring, and we know that was a challenge in 2023. But the other thing that comes out on this graph, and it's maybe not immediately apparent, but if you look at that dashed line and you do a regression analysis, over time, that yield increase goes up the more years you're using the cover crop. And we've seen that time and time again in the survey. And one way to look at that is just pull out the farmers have been doing cover crops for 10 years or more. And we see a pretty significant increase there of over 6% on both soybeans and corn. By contrast, the farmers that just had been doing cover crops for 1 or 2 years had much smaller increases, about 3% on soybeans. And in that year, 2022, no statistical difference on corn. So I think both what happens is that we're getting farmers that are starting to improve the soil health is contributing to that yield increase over time, but also they learn how to manage the cover crop, and that gives them better results as well. Planting approach, many farmers are planting their own cover crops. This is, the majority approach they're taking, but some are paying an aerial applicator. We're seeing some pay a neighbor to plant their cover crops. I've been intrigued that ag retailers are still not a predominant tool, but as I talk to farmers individually, they often are having an ag retailer do some of their cover crop seeding, especially the ones new to cover crops. I know on our own family farm in central Illinois, both of the tenants we have one tenant that farms my grandfather's ground. That's how they got into cover cropping, just have their fertilizer dealer spread the cover crop. Seeding method, probably not a surprise that drill is the predominant method, but we are seeing other broadcasting, that orange slice being fairly popular. 12% were broadcasting through airplane. Seeing some growth in the use of precision row crop planters. That can be a way to maybe get over more acres, maybe use a little bit lower seeding rate, and then some other methods as well. The timing of cover crop seeding is still predominantly after cash crop harvest, but and here farmers could choose more than one option, which is why this adds up to more than 100%. We did see that there were a fair number also that were broadcasting before cash crop harvest. Of course, there's been some interest in looking at interseeding even earlier, like when the corn is knee-high. There are a few, and keep in mind this includes horticulture producers and other types of producers that are frost seeding. So certainly a variety of approaches on the seeding. Now, going to the other end of the season, the termination approach, here we see that of those that have a particular approach, they usually use the orange bars. The herbicide is the most common, and then another 10% are sometimes using herbicide. A fair fraction are using winter kill species, especially some of the time. We see some mowing and tillage. Now, I would tell you that's more common among the horticulture users than among the row crop producers. Roller crimping is still relatively small among row crop producers. I don't have that broken out. It'd be a little more common with our horticulture or organic grain farmers. Tarping is something that's pretty specific to small acreage horticulture producers, a way for them to achieve no-till, like if they're just doing an acre of vegetables maybe. But again, a variety of approaches here. How about planting green? This is something we've seen emerging quite strongly over the last several years. It kind of really took off in 2019 when we had such a wet spring, and we've continued to see growth in that. Keep in mind, planting green, I think you're all familiar with it, but it can be anything from cover crops that are a few inches tall to planting into rye that's 5 or 6 feet tall, like in the lower right. And so it's been interesting to see how farmers have made this work. We asked to what extent are they using planting green. On the right is the farmers that were using planting green in most of their fields, 80 to 100% of their fields. On the left is those just using it in a few of their fields, less than 20%, but certainly a variety of approaches here. As far as whether planting green makes it easier to manage their crop, I think at first glance you'd say, well, gosh, that's got to be complex planting into a green living cover. But we find a lot of them say their management is actually simpler. Others say, well, it's about the same complexity. There are a significant fraction that say it's more difficult, but has greater benefits. And then a relatively smaller number say it's not only more difficult, but they're kind of uncertain whether they're going to continue with it and about the benefit. And just a very few said they had tried it and were going to give up on it. So overall, experience pretty positive. And some of that relates to the weed control benefits. You can see 68% said that the weed control was better when planting green, and only 2% said it was worse. So getting that extra cover crop growth to help smother weeds is a big plus. Also getting extra residue. Now, there's always questions about, are diseases going to be worse? Is the nitrogen tie-up going to be worse? Slugs, voles, things like that. So most people, you can see these orange bars, are saying not a big deal for those potential problems. There's some on either end of the spectrum. The ones with green say that was actually better planting green in terms of diseases or slugs, voles. On the other end of the spectrum, there's some that said it was worse when planting green. And I'll tell you, I've looked quite a bit at slugs and voles. Those can be bad in no-till, even without cover crops. It's just any high residue environment can contribute to those. And there are some management techniques we can use. But kind of interesting to see how those potential issues are perceived. The big one, though, of course, is soil moisture. That was when first planting green came onto the scene. The big question, well, is this going to steal moisture? Again, this year, I think it was a problem on a lot of fields where people terminated later than they should have for the spring conditions. Maybe they'd had success with planting green in a wetter spring. But overall, the farmers said in 2022, at least, that they felt that this is helping with soil moisture management about 2/3 of the time. And by contrast, only 7% said it was drying out the soil too much. Now, if we did that survey question again this year, it might have been a higher slice, I imagine. All right, let's move on to a couple final topics here. Incentives is always a big question. What's the role of incentives with cover crops? Definitely people are getting payments these days through a wide variety of methods. Many are getting them through their soil conservation district, but it depends on the state. Of course, NRCS offers cover crop payments nationwide through both the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. I was personally surprised to see a few more were getting funds through CSP for their cover crop. Keep in mind, it's a lower payment rate for the cover crop, but typically they're getting paid for a wider variety of practices under the CSP program. Whereas with EQIP, they may be signing up just for a cover crop payment, although some are applying for multiple payments. Private company payments, of course, are emerging over the last 2 to 3 years, and I think that's going to continue to grow in the short term at least. 16% had received a private company payment for cover crops. Crop insurance rebates are getting more popular. I think there was a little bit of confusion with the way the question was worded when the pandemic cover crop program came in, because that really should have been a higher number based on what USDA is telling us about how many farmers filed for that. I think some saw the crop insurance rebate and equated that to the pandemic. But regardless, we've seen farmers getting some benefits from those crop insurance tie-ins. Total years of incentive payments is interesting, and this reflects in part the fact we have farmers with a wide number of experiences with years of cover cropping. We did have quite a few farmers in the survey this year that had had 10 years or more. And although most of our incentive payment programs are 2 to 3 years, CSP can be 5 years. Some farmers have been strategic about kind of getting multiple different programs that have supported their cover cropping over time. Or what may happen is, and I think this is probably the bigger case, is they get a payment for one field, but then maybe they start renting some new ground and get a payment on that ground as well. So, but overall, we see there are some farmers that have been collecting some incentive payments for a long time. Now, we've all heard the comment, well, farmers are only doing cover crops because they're getting paid to do it. But in fact, the survey shows that that's not the case. First of all, we've seen in past surveys, a lot of farmers don't collect payments for cover crops. But we asked, if what's your intention once that payment ends? 2/3 said they were definitely going to continue the cover crop, and another 22% probably so. So you add those two together, and 90% are saying they're probably going to continue their cover crops after the payments end. So I thought that was a pretty strong endorsement versus only 1% saying they're definitely going to stop after those incentive payments end. So what can we summarize from the experience, the farmers that have had some experience using cover crops, especially those doing it several years? And I'm basing this not only on this year's survey, but some past ones. Clearly, as I said earlier, more use of cover crop mixes over time, and that they continue to plant more and more acreage. Many obviously start with just a field or two, but then they have some success and they start adding additional fields of cover crops. I've found it interesting that some are reducing fertilizers, roughly half, and some are reducing herbicides, again, roughly half, but not all. And I think that does change over time, both from individual farmer conversations and some of the data. But it's not an immediate thing that they start cutting fertilizers right away. Many of the farmers are economizing on their seeding rates. They may have started out being in an EQIP program where they were required to put on, 50 pounds of cereal rye, but then they find for their needs that they're happy with 20 or 30 pounds of cereal rye or a lower rate. And they also get more efficient at their seeding methods. Maybe they start using a row crop planter that allows them to cut back on rates a little bit. Many also try to grow that cover crop for longer. Instead of planting the rye in late October, they start flying it on or overseeding it early, or maybe they go to an earlier maturity cash crop so they can get that cover crop in early. And of course, on the other end, they're leaving it growing longer in the spring, including planting green. And then I also find it interesting that many find the cover crop benefits get them thinking about their overall soil health management and get them looking at things like less tillage if they have been doing some tillage, or maybe adding another crop to the rotation. Certainly, these experienced farmers would say they're achieving better soil health over time, and most of them are achieving better yields over time, not necessarily in the first year, but as they get benefits to the soil health and experience with that cover crop. So I want to just wrap up with a few slides on the non-adopters of cover crops. We had a smaller number of those farmers responding, but still a significant number of responses. I will say I've always considered this group that are people not yet using cover crops who respond to the survey probably somewhat biased in the sense that if they have zero interest in cover crops, they're probably less likely to fill out the survey. And you can see that many of them said, well, yes, I'm probably or definitely interested in cover crops, or at least maybe interested in them. Not very many of them said they had no interest. So keep that in mind, that this probably doesn't represent the whole spectrum of those not using cover crops. What are the concerns of those that did respond, though, that haven't used cover crops yet? Again, here they could choose multiple responses. So they're concerned about, the potential economic impact. Is it going to affect the yield of their cash crop? What's the risk? I think particularly the risk to planting their cash crop in the spring. Generally, in the past, we found that the time or labor was the number one concern. So this was slightly different than some of the past surveys, but also because of the way the question was worded differently this year. Less concern about some of these other things, though, like insects or diseases, maybe the field being too wet, but certainly interesting to see where those concerns are at. Now, what might help these farmers be more comfortable in doing cover crops if they have a clearer picture of what's going to be the economic return? And how do incentive payments fit in? I think obviously that's been a powerful tool for getting more farmers on board, getting some one-on-one technical assistance where they can. There is interest in soil carbon payments, although we know that's been a bit confusing for farmers, all the different choices. Many respond favorably to having some tours of cover crops in their area. And I know in Illinois, there's an effort to do more of those. And then having some discounted crop insurance premiums was not as powerful for the group as a whole, but some were certainly strongly interested in that. Just a few other things here on the non-adopters. If they could clearly see that they were going to reduce their crop input costs like fertilizers or herbicides, would that be motivating? A fair number, about almost a third, said they strongly agreed, and another big fraction, the orange bars, said they agreed with that statement. So that's something for us to be thinking about in communication. Certainly, we don't want to overpromise, but I think saying that about half of the farmers eventually reduce either their fertilizers or their pesticides or both is something to help people be aware of. They're also interested in knowing how the cover crop is going to help on their farm. I find that important as opposed to just benefits in general. What's the specific fit for their farm? And then even though there have been a lot of changes in crop insurance to really remove the barriers to cover crops, there's still some lingering perception questions about that. So I think that's something we need to be upfront talking about, that this is not going to affect your crop insurance to go out and use cover crops. So I'll just end by saying you can see the full survey results. And again, I showed you about half of the data from the SARE CTI survey. Just do a search for SARE CTIC cover crop survey or SARE cover crop survey. You'll find it posted on both the SARE and CTIC websites. As we've seen, every time we've done the survey, there's strong interest and the cover crop acreage keeps growing. So happy to have a chance to share this and take any questions or comments from folks.
All right, thank you, Rob. That's a lot of information packed into a short presentation. We appreciate that. I guess we'll go ahead and jump right into questions. I think the first one I'd like to start with, and Corey, if I can put you on the spot, can you kind of put into verbal words what you and Frank were kind of discussing here in the chat about land ownership and how that's affecting the cover crop adoption? I wonder if you could just expand on that and kind of get Rob's thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I say it all the time, and Rob's presentation kind of made me re-question myself, is I say all the time, hey, our big challenge with conservation broadly, and especially with cover crops, is 60% of the land isn't owned by the guy farming it. And if we got that adoption up, then we'd have more people cover cropping. And, there are two slides in this deck that made me really rethink that. The first one where I commented, and it, the rate of cover crop adoption didn't increase until you got to 100%. Otherwise, it was what I would call basically the same. And so I was, that made me first question it. And then if you go down in the deck a little bit later where it talks about what would motivate non-adopters, when asked about concerns on rented ground, the ranking of that as an important aspect was really low. And so I think that I'm not the only one that talks about that. And it just made me really rethink. I'm like, is the data telling us that that's not the issue? Is that a red herring that we're pursuing? Or is there some kind of bias in this study? And by bias, I mean, like, I'm not criticizing the study. I'm just saying, is there of the respondents, don't hear me criticize SARE or anything in that comment, but
yeah.
that's influencing that.
And yeah, Corey, really great to bring up, and obviously has been a big question a lot of people have asked, and I don't think we have a complete picture of this. I think what we can say is among the people using cover crops, as you noted, there's not a big difference between those that own their ground or rent. Now, as you talk, and many of you have had this experience yourself, as you talk individually to farmers, they may say, well, I started using a cover crop on the ground I owned, and then as I saw the benefits, I started using it on my rented ground. But of course, keep in mind, many of our farmers today in areas like Illinois and Iowa are either 100% rented or most of what they have is rented ground. Linda Prokopi at Purdue University, some of you may know her, has had some students and postdocs do some surveys specifically on land ownership and management. And, I think there are some subtle differences there. What we don't really get at very successfully with the SARE CTIC survey is that whole population of non-adopters. And I suspect if you just asked some of the non-adopters, they'd say, Yeah, but as you noted, the ones that did respond to our survey, that wasn't nearly as big of a factor as others. So I think it's a small factor, but not as big as we probably thought in the past, is what I would conclude.
So I don't want to hog the conversation, but just when you're responding, this kind of came to me, which is that so the SARE has done a really good job of helping us understand the adopters and their perspective. But how do we, as associations that want to grow cover crops, talk to and even just understand the perspective of these non-adopters? Like I think we need to start thinking about non-traditional ways or avenues that we haven't pursued in the past to talk to these guys, or just to understand their perspective. Because I think that's something we're not capturing.
Well, we have to talk about what their concerns are. And of course, that varies from farmer to farmer. But you saw the high responses, which were things like, is my yield going to be impacted? Am I going to have more trouble planting my cash crop? Past surveys, the top two things were the time to plant the cover crop in the fall. It was just a feeling, I don't have time to deal with this. So my answer to that has always been, well, look to your ag retailer, or do it with a trip you're already making over the field. If you're doing vertical tillage, you can be seeding with that vertical tillage tool. So, and then of course the yield questions, we just got to provide data, try to provide a picture of that, help them understand that, yeah, there can be a yield loss if you don't manage correctly. But if you're careful, you're probably going to see not a big difference in the first year you use cover crops. And then over time, you have the potential to get some modest yield benefits as that soil improves and you get more experience with them.
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Corey. So let's see, for the next question, this is something that we actually touched on in the call to prepare for this. Just one thing that always stands out in these surveys is the yield impacts of cover crops, right? That's whatever it gets everybody going, right? And so Talon had a question, and I'm going to try not to butcher this, Talon, so feel free to jump in if I'm screwing it up. But basically, we showed that regression analysis of the yield impacts. And, how are we dealing with the outliers there? I think Talon was referencing some farms with greater than 20 years of experience, maybe being some outliers. How are we addressing outliers in that data and those summaries?
Yeah, every year we do the survey for the yields. We do statistical procedures to remove outliers because you'll get some farmers making typos or just other obvious problems in there. So those outliers are clipped off, and then what's left is what you saw there. Clearly, there's different experiences, and I hear these anecdotally as I talk to the farmers. They may have a dramatic yield reduction because of just something that went horribly wrong, like getting very dry soil, or maybe they went in and tilled the cover crop and had this clumpy mess and, just could not get a good stand to their cash crop. But on the flip side, they may have some real benefits. I had a farmer here in central Missouri tell me about how he ended up having an 18 bushel higher soybean yield than his neighbor because he got this big rain. We had a very dry year in central Missouri, but he got a big rain in August. All that moisture soaked in for him and his neighbor. It was standing water in the fields. The soybeans got diseased by his neighbor. The neighbor had to come in and spray fungicides because of that standing water. And so, it just can obviously depend on experience, but I think,
I'd say perhaps I mean, outlier may not be the correct statistical term that I was talking about. I wasn't talking about y-axis outliers. I was talking about those that were on the, 20 plus years of crop. So if you took out those 5 or so data points, I think that are above 20 years, I'm just curious how that affects that trend line.
Well, I haven't tried that analysis for this year. I would say like the most intense look we did at the years of experience was in our 2015 and 16 surveys, and we did not have as many farmers with 10 plus years of experience at that point, very few in fact. And that regression was still really strong statistically upwards. I mean, it's not a real steep line, but it's clearly there, statistically significant increase over time. So,
okay, thanks.
I have a question that many of us who have worked with farmers that are kind of just getting started with cover crops, or even those who maybe dabbled in it for just a few years, and are still kind of on the fence about whether or not to continue. What information is there in this survey that we can help ourselves, help the farmers? Because we always hear about this 3 to 5 year transition from going from a more conventional system to more of a cover cropping regenerative system, and that transition period can be a little bit rocky or a little rough for the farmer. What information in this survey can we use to help sort of calm some of those fears and will help reassure farmers that, you know, this is a system that can work?
I'd come at that in two ways. The first thing I'd say is the survey shows is perfectly okay to obtain incentive payments that, you know, a majority of farmers are doing that. And there's a wide variety of ways they're getting those from their state or federal government or private sources, whatever works for them, and that will ease that cost of that transition period. So that's the first thing I would say. The second is that these practices are showing that they can address specific needs on the farm. So if they're battling herbicide-resistant weeds, there's clearly data showing that the majority of farmers are seeing a really positive benefit from that, both in controlling the weeds and in half the cases reducing herbicide cost. If they're trying to deal with compaction, we have positive data on that. I didn't show the data on grazing, but you know, that's another thing that is helping get more and more farmers interested. So bottom line, for their specific situation, there's probably a reason the cover crop can be helpful to them.
Okay, great.
I know we've got to get you out of here a little early, Rob, but I'll try to sneak in one more question if we can. One thing that came up on our prep call for this was just how long you've been doing the survey. And I wondered if you could touch on some items, you know, what over that, say, decade or so, what has changed, what has stayed the same? How can we kind of project that to try to understand where things are moving in the next 10 years, for example?
The biggest thing that's changed that I just referred to is the number of farmers with a lot of years of experience. When we did that first survey in 2012, most of the farmers that responded that, yeah, I'm using a cover crop, had just been doing them for a year or two. There were a handful that were in that 3 to 5 year, but not many that were like 10 years or more. There were a small number. But now we're seeing much bigger numbers that have 5, 10 or more years of experience. And I think for us that are trying to do education programs, that's a positive because we've got more farmers out there that have experience they can share with their neighbors. And so obviously it's great if we can tap their expertise and help network them with those that haven't yet made this transition.
All right. Helen, Rachel, do you think we have time for one more question, or do we want to move on to our next section?
I think we can get one more in.
Get one more in. Is there anybody in the audience that would like to just come off mute and throw one out here? Otherwise, we can dig one out of our pool here. Let's see. Frank, do you have any burning questions from the pool that you'd like to?
I think the
ask?
only one that we haven't hit that I just wanted to know, just, you know, say of this year or overall, you know, what is that one result maybe this year that you sat down and didn't expect? What's been the most surprising thing for you to learn out of all of this?
Well, I don't know if there was anything that really surprised me, but I think the thing we learned this year that we didn't know the answer on, that a lot of policymakers have been asking, is how many of these farmers are going to continue once the incentive payments end. And so that's what we actually led with in our report, was that 90% figure that, you know, 2/3 said definitely yes. And when you put together the definitely and probably, it was 90% said they probably would be continuing with cover crops after the incentive payments ended. So I think that was a pretty powerful thing, because for those that are, I mean, all of you are fairly familiar with cover crops, but for people that don't know a lot about it, you know, there's this kind of myth out there that, well, they're just doing it because they're getting paid, and once the money goes away, all these cover crops are going to go away. And so I think we had some really good data to show that's not the case.
Yeah, awesome. It'd be interesting, I think, to break that down a little further to understand of people doing it 10 years, how many wouldn't need the money to continue versus 5 to 10 versus 1 to 5 and see how that changes. I think you'd get a lot more of those early adopters or those people with less experience, a little bit more tied to the financials up front. So yeah, that'd be an interesting thing to dig into. But yeah, I think I'll kick it off to you, Tori. I think you're gonna kind of share a little bit more about the next section.
Sure. Yeah, I know with Rob, I know you need to kind of bug out a little early here. You've got another call that you need to be part on. So, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for the information. We hope to keep in touch with you. And I'm sure there's a lot more questions and a lot more data and information that can be gleaned from the survey. So we appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on. We have just a few updates and future call updates we'd like to offer. And actually, Helen, if I can lean on you a little bit to go over some of the ISAP resources that we want to make sure everybody is aware of.
Sure. Hot off the press, we have published an Introduction to Soil Health Practices, which is like a 30-page guidebook that, as the slide shows, includes technical advice, scientific research, and features the stories of 6 farmers in Illinois who have found success with conservation practices. So we hope that this is going to be a helpful resource for people in learning more about the benefits of these practices, how they can help address agronomic challenges in the field, and then learn from farmers who are sharing their story. So I just dropped a link in the chat there where you can find the PDF version. And if you see us at conferences or events over the next few months, we'll have paper copies. So that's an exciting update. And then wanted to also plug the ISAP cover crop seed dealers directory. This is a directory of seed dealers in Illinois, sort of organized, has their location, their contact information, and then what kind of services they provide. So Rob was talking a lot about if people are having a hard time getting into the field to plant their cover crops, that they could, reach out to their retailer service provider. So this is a great resource to find people who are not just selling seed, but also offering some of those services that help, with that cover crop system. And then the next one we'll share is the cover crop incentive directory that ISAP's put together. So again, Rob was talking a lot about incentive programs and where people are getting their funding from. ISAP put this together over a year ago now, and it has 15 different programs that are offering payments for planting cover crops, and also includes a stacking matrix so you can see if you're enrolled in one program, which other programs you can and can't combine. And I think this is also kind of a call to people on the call. If there are new incentive programs that that have come online in the past year, they likely aren't on this directory, or if there's ones that have sort of phased out. So we put this together really through the ICCON calls, just kind of crowdsourcing this information. And we're in the process of developing an online version of this tool. So if people have, if they know about other incentive programs that should be included that have come online, we'd appreciate, being in the loop on that.
All right, thank you, Helen. Also, I believe we probably just dropped the link in the chat for our ICON survey. We want to encourage everybody to continue to fill that out. I believe we're closing that December 15th. So I want to make sure if you have not had a chance to complete that survey, please do so. Help us to improve our ICON calls. We welcome your input. And then we just want to, I guess, to start with, let's open it up. Are there any other events, webinars, anything that anybody would like to share with us? We have a few on the list, and one of the in-person events I want to make sure everybody is aware of, I'm sure you are, is that we do have the National No-Till Conference coming up in January. I intend to be there myself. Would love to, meet up with anybody on the call and network and discuss. And yeah, if there's anything else that people would like to make us all aware of, now is the time. Please let us know.
There's a lot of stuff
Frank,
coming up.
yeah, there's a lot of things coming up. So anything we'd like to know about?
So CCA annual conference tomorrow, Farm Assets Conference Friday. And then into January, Fertilizer Chemical Association, 16th to the 18th. Iowa has our educator over in Monmouth Station is co-organizing 2 crop advantage conferences, one in Davenport, one in Burlington. Those are on the Burlington's 11th, Davenport's the 19th of January. Rachel's got the NLRS conference coming up on the 25th. And then we have our commercial ag team crop management conferences, February 1st, 8th, or sorry, 1st, 7th, and 15th in Collinsville, Champaign, and Sycamore, respectively. And then online option available as well that will start on the 16th and run. It's asynchronous. We'll have it open through the end of April for people to watch presentations and get CEUs if they would like to do that.
Alan, were those dates February? The 1st, 7th, and 15th?
Yes. And we have we're working with HR with comms to get everything posted here soon. So the event page has been, I'm sorry, the web page has been updated with this year's information. We're trying to get event pages posted all before break, as well as registration available before we go on Christmas break.
I was just seeing here too. I'll make sure everybody is aware of particular interest to most of us on this call. January 25th, we'll have the Illinois NLRS Partnership Conference. I believe that's both an in-person and virtual option. So would love to have as many people attending that as possible. And then our next ICON call will be January 10th, and we intend to have the PCM business case for conservation presentation. So we're looking forward to that. Anything else anybody would like to add to the conversation today?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Midwest Cover Crop Council meeting in Indy.
That's right,
on
Indy.
the business meeting the 13th, the conference in the 14th of February.
Yeah, and Rob Myers will be presenting on a different topic at that conference.
Yeah.
So you can catch him again there. Yeah, I had a question that the PCM business case for conservation reminded me. You know, there was that one slide that Rob shared about the importance of sharing, you know, information on how these practices are economically beneficial for farmers. And so I'm curious from people on the call, what resources are people pointing to help share that information? I know the PCM business case for conservation is helpful. American Farmland Trust has published some soil health case studies with 2 farmers in Illinois that kind of break that down and kind of show the economic side of it. But if people are aware of other resources, I think those would be helpful to share. And a little teaser for 2024, ISOP is planning to host a risk management conference or webinar series, which we host every other year. And it's really to showcase the risk management and those economic benefits of these practices, sort of setting aside the water quality and other environmental benefits, and really just emphasizing, you know, why these are good for the economics on the farm. So if there's a topic that you've heard that you feel like would be interesting to dig into more, we're working on putting together that webinar series. I'm open to suggestions at this point.
All right, well, we're just about at time. So if there's nothing else anybody would like to add, we'll go ahead and get things wrapped up for today. Just appreciate everybody's attendance, and we look forward to seeing you in January. Feel free to reach out and connect with anybody in the meantime. Happy to accept any and all input on ICON calls. So don't forget to do the survey. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.